Hello again, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, The Silverchair Universe Presents Hypothesis. My name is Stephanie Lovegrove. I'm the marketing manager here at Silverchair, and we're excited to have you with us today as we learn more about Hypothesis. We have Nate Angel, the Director of Marketing from Hypothesis, who will be taking us through their offering. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. Attendees have all been muted, so if you have questions throughout the webinar, please type them into the chat box, and we'll be happy to address those either as they come up, or we'll also have some time at the end of the presentation. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you afterwards. Finally, when the webinar is concluded, you'll get a brief survey, and we appreciate if you could take a moment just to complete that to help us improve both the Universe program itself as well as the webinar series. And with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Nate.
Greetings, everyone. I'm Nate Angel from Hypothesis, as Stephanie said, and I'm coming to you from what seems to be turning out to be a moderately sunny day here in Portland, Oregon, which is a rare thing here in Portland. We have a lot of rain out here, and so it's nice to see a little bit of sun now and then. So normally you would be participating in this webinar with my colleague Heather Staines, our Director of Partnerships, but she is unable to make it today, and so she asked me if I would sit in and lead you through what Hypothesis does in conjunction with Silverchair, for publishers. So just to kind of go over what we are going to talk about today, I want to tell you a little bit about Hypothesis itself, because we're a little bit of a unique organization, and then talk about how Hypothesis and annotation in the Hypothesis model works in general, how it can be integrated into your publications on the Silverchair platform, and then some examples that are drawn from real-life use cases from other publishers who are using annotation and Hypothesis already in their works. And then we'll also have time for Q&A at the end, as Stephanie said. Anywhere along the way, if I hit upon something that you would like further clarification about, feel free, as Stephanie said, to put something in the chat, and I am happy to pause and address and give more detail about anything as we move along. So just in general, to start talking about Hypothesis as an organization. And so unlike some other organizations, one of the things that's different about Hypothesis is that we're a nonprofit organization. So we are primarily a technology provider, but we do that in a nonprofit context. And so we receive funding from foundations, for example, as part of our work, in addition to serving customers like folks on the Silverchair platform. And we're a nonprofit partially because it's our goal to help establish a wider ecosystem for standards-based annotation in general. And we feel that it's going to be easiest for us to do that and to support that move as a nonprofit. So all our code is for the annotation capabilities themselves is released under a permissive open source license. It follows the annotation standards set by the W3C that we can talk about a little bit more. And then we work closely with platform providers like Silverchair and publishers like yourselves in order to bring annotation to your publications and to your users in ways that really support you, what you want to do. As it's going now, we're just in the fall ticked off our 4 millionth annotation, and you can see by this graph there's a kind of academic term-based pattern to the kind of usage that Hypothesis has generated since we launched. And so you'll see that, like in December, when academics tend to go dormant for a little while, there's a little break off then, but then the next term picks up and usage rises again. And so already here in January, we're seeing even more increased usage than we saw last January. So each academic turn is kind of building on our success. And you'll notice also that these annotation counts are broken down into some kind of subcategories around the degree to which the annotations are public or private or in groups. And we'll be talking a lot more about groups as we go through this, because groups are one of the tools that publishers can really use to get great advantages out of annotation. So one of the things that is core to the way that Hypothesis is dedicated to delivering annotation is to do it according and following web standards. And this is partially because we want to help foster a kind of scholarly ecosystem where annotation is a capability that's kind of available everywhere in every context, so that researchers, students, publishers, everyone involved in the scholarly communications network is able to interact with annotations that have some kind of standard characteristics. And a lot of that also has to do with the way that annotations can participate as data elements on the back end in that scholarly ecosystem as well, which we'll be talking about more. So Hypothesis was one of the kind of key parties in helping the W3C standards body set the web annotation standard back in 2017. And so it's part of our core offering to make sure that the annotation capabilities that we're offering follow this standard. And one of the things that we kind of like to talk about, especially with publishers who may have had comments available on their sites for better or for worse, is some of the ways that annotation is different than commenting. And so one of the kind of key differences between commenting and annotation, as you all know from probably using commentary yourself, is that comments have a tendency to be kind of at the bottom of the page, right? They're kind of an ancillary addition to the page, rather than being fully integrated in the text, where you're reading the text and able to see highlighted portions, very specific portions of that text that are then linked to annotated commentary. And so there's that. Comments kind of provide a separation from the text, whereas annotation are embedded directly in the text and can provide that kind of more intimate connection between the annotations and the text itself. Annotations also have the capability of working in kind of individual, kind of public and private modes, as well as these group modes that we'll talk about more. And then they generate, because they're following, again, these standards, metadata that can then be fed into scholarly systems like Crossref or search algorithms like Google's, so that they become, they kind of exist as scholarly objects unto themselves, just like the publications that they decorate. So for example, web annotations have each annotation has its own persistent web address, as if it were a tiny web page itself associated with the text that it's modifying. And at the same time, thanks to the standardization and the way that Hypothesis delivers annotations are also available via an API. So for the more technically minded among you, you can use the API to access annotations and deliver them in other contexts, or do other kinds of work with annotations outside of the context of them just appearing for the users on the text that they decorate. And so one of the kind of fundamental metaphors that Hypothesis uses to describe how annotation works in our environment is this idea of layers. And so at the bottom layer, right, is that text itself, the publication of record that you're looking to annotate or to offer annotation to. And then there's the ability to layer on multiple layers of annotations that kind of belong to or pertain to different group context. And so there's a kind of crossover there between the idea of groups and the idea of layers. So you can have the fully public layer that brings together everyone on top of fully public annotations on top of a text, or you can have layer of annotations that's dedicated to a specific group of annotators. And when we get into the use cases, we'll really be talking more about how those specific groups can work. So in this example, right, you might have a layer of the fully public annotations. There might be a private layer of a group from an academic course given at a college or university where they're annotating privately together so that only they are seeing their annotations. There might be an annotated layer of expert commentary where a publisher has invited a group of people to provide a kind of extra value-added content through an annotation layer on top. And so there's this idea that you can layer on multiple layers of annotation. And so I don't want to get too technical in this talk, but one of the things that's good to understand about the way Hypothesis works is that it kind of follows this sort of classic client-server model, right? And for people who aren't technical, like I'm not really that technical of a person, the easier way to understand this is the client is the tool that you as a human use to actually annotate, right? So the client is the actual interface that pops open on the text that you use in order to highlight and annotate material online. But when you do that annotation, the annotations are saved to a server environment that lives in the cloud, if you will, so that your annotations are stored in a safe, centralized place so that you can access them or other people can access them from multiple locations, right? So it's not just something that happens in the context of your computer alone. So there's some value that we think that really comes out of providing annotation in this way with this client-server architecture on a standards-based model when you're a publisher, because it enables you as a publisher to really continue to kind of add value on top of the content that you're already publishing without taking readers away from that. So it kind of redirects readers back toward your publication in the version that you're publishing, right? And gives them reason to want to visit that content more than once because there's a conversation happening there, or there's updated information happening there, or there are new voices appearing on top of that publication in order to give new perspectives and so forth on it. And there's a lot of different use cases, as I mentioned, that we can talk about more later when we get into that. And so part of this idea of making sure that annotation appears directly on top of the version of record is also to enable you as a publisher to kind of increase engagement there, right? And center your users back on your primary kind of offering to the world. And so there's a couple of capabilities that Hypothesis offers to help make that possible. And so one of them is this idea that we'll see examples of is the idea of you as a publisher being able to offer a branded and moderated annotation group that is really specific to your readers or to your invited experts or to your editorial team. And we'll talk about those kind of different use cases. So you can really kind of add one of those layers that we were talking about that's specific to one or even multiple use cases that you have as a publisher. And then there's different kind of control models for those groups so that they can, you can control these group layers so that maybe only certain kinds of people are invited to annotate. Maybe it's your editorial team, your authors, your invited experts, and so forth. But everyone in the public can see those annotations. Or perhaps you want to provide a group layer that includes everybody who's a registered user in your publication or a subscriber. Or perhaps you want to provide a fully open public group in layer as well. And so all those possibilities exist. And so let's talk about those kind of models a little bit more deeply. And so we call these this idea of publishers having, kind of branded and configured groups, publisher groups. And so one of the fundamental things is that as we get into the interface, and I'll jump over and show you some live examples in a second, you can actually have the layer include your logo and your the name of your journal or whatever you want to do in order to make it clear that that layer, that conversation of annotation is happening in the context of your publication. And so there's, like I was saying, different models of that in terms of who can both make annotations and who can read those annotations, as well as the ability to moderate the annotations that happen so that you can make sure that you have control over the conversation that's happening. And then there's also some configuration that can happen in terms of the way in which annotations kind of default in the context of your publication. So as we'll see, annotations are added by highlighting, right? I highlight a piece of text, and then I might add an annotation note to that highlighted text, and the highlight serves as a kind of anchor. Well, maybe you want the highlights to appear by default on your publications, so that it's really clear where the annotations are and that people can kind of click through those highlights and see the annotations. Or maybe you want a clean reading experience where the annotations are highlighting is turned off by default. All those kinds of different possibilities are configurable. And so depending on your specific needs and the user experience you want to provide on your site, different kind of configurations can be made. And so as I was mentioning, there are these different kinds of kind of permission configuration options as well that we already talked about, where we can have what we might call an open group, right? Where everyone can join that group and write to it. It's a branded layer that pertains to your publication, but everyone who visits has the permission to add annotations to it. And of course, everyone then also has permission to view those annotations. Or you might want to have a restricted group, right? Where only key certain folks are given the ability to make the annotations, whereas the whole world can read what they write. And then you could have multiple layers or groups, right, with different kinds of configurations depending on the different kind of use cases that you wanted to set up. And I'll show you a couple examples of some publishers who've used that kind of model. Another key thing are a capability that Hypothesis offers, where there are sort of dashboards where users can view all the annotations that are made, for instance, in a particular group, on a particular layer, for a particular publication, by a particular user, pertaining to a particular tag. And so there's kind of a rich interface to browse and search through annotations outside of the context of the published work, so that if one wants to kind of look across annotations, like all the annotations that a particular group has made, for example, but each one of those annotation records then has a link back to the context of the annotation in situ in the publication of record. And so there's both that ability to experience annotations directly in the text themselves, as well as experiencing them in this kind of more generalized browse and search kind of mode. So Hypothesis also tries to work with each publisher in order to make sure that their implementation of annotation is well tailored to their needs. And so from the beginning of a relationship with a publisher who wants to go down this road of using Hypothesis, we work with them closely to make sure that the technical details of getting annotations on their publication are going to happen in a way that makes sense. And that's where we would also be partnering with Silverchair, obviously, in order to make that happen in the Silverchair context. And then we also work closely with the publisher in order to ensure that the groups and layers are set up with the kind of branding and kind of configuration options that each publisher would want. Then once annotation is kind of live and rolling, we also partner with publishers in order to make sure that the kind of activity that they want to see happen with annotation is actually happening. And so there's all sorts of things that can happen, whether it's just a matter of communications and getting the word out to your constituencies, whether it's measuring the results, and whether it's changing the configuration in order to meet new use cases or unanticipated use cases. And then, of course, Hypothesis as an organization is standing behind this infrastructure to make sure that the annotation code base is both maintained and also advancing, so new features are happening with it, and that the annotation server that's storing all these annotations that are made in the context of your annotation is a healthy, robust environment that can actually serve them. And so these are the kind of services that Hypothesis is providing, both with you and behind the scenes, in order to make sure that annotation is successful for you. Just some examples of the kind of analytics that we can provide to help you, know what's going on with annotation in your publication, or to measure what's happening with annotation generally. And so you can just think about the kinds of entities that are interacting with annotation, right? There's the annotations themselves. How many annotations are there? How many are public? How many are private? How many are in this group? How many are in that group? Are there key annotators, whether it's, maybe somebody from your community, or whether it's a kind of external entity that's doing some kind of machine-based annotation, as in the Cybot example, which we'll talk about more. What kind of annotations are happening, and how can we measure them and talk about them? Same is true for people, right? Or machine-based annotators. Who's annotating? How many of them are there? How actively are they annotating? What's the kind of volume of annotation? Are there patterns to that? What's happening? And then measurements around the documents or publications that are being annotated. Which pages or journals are being annotated the most? Where are we seeing hotspots of annotation, that kind of thing. And so there are different ways to kind of slice and dice this data. And what we like to do is work with publishers in order to figure out, what's important to you to measure. And then we try to make sure that we can deliver analytics to you that help you understand what's going on in a way that's useful to the kinds of outcomes that you're looking to support. So that's the kind of all the general background about Hypothesis, and I hope I didn't move through it too quickly or too slowly, actually, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time just showing off a couple key examples of annotation the way real publishers have implemented it, so that you can kind of get some real examples flowing in your mind, and that might relate to ways that you could see your publications using them as well. So one example is an open publisher named eLife that publishes in the biomedical science realm. You're probably familiar with it. And so eLife was actually the first publisher to go live with what we call a publisher group. And what you're seeing on this page in front of you now, on the left-hand side is the eLife, online delivery of a particular article. In this case, an article that is way outside of my wheelhouse, and so I have no idea what it's talking about. Really, I can barely read the title, but it's clearly a highly specialized scientific article. On the right-hand side of the screen, the sort of right third of the screen, you see this extra interface that's popped open, and with a little eLife logo at the top. And that is the annotation side panel that pops open in order to show where there are annotations on this publication, in this case, eLife. And so you can see there's some sort of data around this. In this annotation pane, there are 6 annotations on this article, and you can start to see them as we go down. Several by the first couple, at least, as we're looking down the document, by the same person. And you can see both the text that they anchored, which is in this kind of light gray italics, right? So that's the text in the article that they highlighted in order to anchor their annotation. And then the annotation itself, which is this darker, longer body of text where they've added onto it. And so eLife actually helped fund the development of publisher groups, and so we thank them for that, and they were one of the first people to implement it. And so we're now in a position to be able to offer that out to wider groups of publishers as well. So big shout out to eLife there, who then also uses the annotation capability not only for that kind of conversation or enrichment of the text like we saw in the last slide, but here in another article, eLife has actually used the annotation layer in order to provide kind of errata and corrections to this particular article. So in this case, you can see how in the abstract, the chloroplast function is highlighted, and that leads to an annotation that is a kind of correction or addendum to that originally published article. And so this is already one example of two different ways that annotation groups can be used. And so just to kind of walk through some other examples here, another similar use case to that kind of errata model is what the American Diabetes Association uses annotation for. And so, every year they publish this, kind of key document in the diabetes world, this medical care and diabetes. And so that's only published on this annual basis, but a lot of information happens in the meantime, right? So between one January and the next, diabetes is a vibrant, living scientific practice, and so a lot of stuff happens. And so they use annotation as a way to decorate that, the last published work from medical care and diabetes with new outcomes, corrections, modifications, other publications that relate to that canonical work and so forth. And so they're using a layer of annotation where only the editorial team at ADA is writing the annotations, but the whole world is seeing them. And so they're using it in that kind of specialized way. Another really interesting example is a collaborative effort housed at Syracuse University called the Qualitative Data Repository. And they have this program that is centered on helping social scientists and social science publications add extra layers of often qualitative data that stand behind the publication or the article of record, right? And so a lot of times in the social sciences, especially the material that sits underneath the article, the kind of data and kind of raw materials, if you will, of the article itself are often varied. It may be other documents that are in different languages. It might be video recordings or audio recordings. There's all sorts of different kinds of kind of components that might have gone into that analysis that's published. And so QDR and its ATI program are collaborative that works in order to make that deeper layer of materials visible behind the publication by adding them in annotation layers. And so they do kind of very detailed, structured annotations on top of articles that include things like the bullet points that are listed in this slide: the author context, source exports, translations, links to a repository of extra data that they maintain, full citation information, and so forth. And so this is another example of how the annotation layer can be used to add depth to a publication of record without also cluttering it up so much, right? So these records are immediately available in the context of reading the article, but not getting in the reader's way either. Another example, eJournalPress is using the annotation layer for peer review. And so you can see how, regardless of what a peer review model might look like, the annotation layer could be used to serve peer review either in a private context with a fully private group where only the peer reviewers and editors are members and only the peer reviewers and editors can see and add annotations in that group. Or it might be an open peer review model, right, where only certain people are invited to review, but everyone has access to that open peer review model. And there are variations in between as well. And so there are kind of editorial workflows that can also be fueled or sort of powered by annotation. Another example of that is what Springer has been working on, where they actually used annotation kind of in the way back behind the scenes in a kind of quality assurance activities when they were working to publish a large number of material in a new context, and they had to kind of work through that as their editorial team, migrating it from one format to another. And so they used the annotation layer as a kind of private communications channel in order to help their team make sure that the publications that they were bringing to the world were actually correct and went through that process of format translation appropriately. And so you can see if we look at this kind of view of a kind of window into over 10,000 annotations they made as they were working to do this quality assurance on top of the XML that was going to be the new publication format for these documents. Then we have other use cases like the American Society for Microbiology, which was, again, working to publish a whole host of documents in order to move them to a new publication status. And so they, like Springer, also had that sort of use case of behind the scenes editorial control. And again, a smaller scale, but we're creating multiple annotations across multiple documents in order to make sure that that publication happened appropriately. I mentioned Scibot in an earlier slide as a possible key annotator on top of material. And so Scibot is a really interesting program housed at the University of California, San Diego. And this is, again, outside my wheelhouse, but I've learned about it. It's a really interesting use case. So in a lot of scientific literature, and you guys probably know this better than I do, there are unique identifiers called, I believe, research resource identifiers, and they're RRIs, and those are particular unique codes, kind of metadata that are attached to specific research components. So it might be anything from a particular enzyme that's used in an experiment to maybe a strain of a mouse that's used in experiments that has a particular genetic configuration, might be some sort of piece of equipment, whatever. All these research components have these unique IDs. And so if articles are published with that metadata embedded in the article itself, Scibot is kind of a robot, if you will, that can come into an article with that kind of metadata in it and add annotations in either the public layer or in a specifically dedicated layer that actually link to deeper information about each one of those research components, right? And so if the article that one is reading in front of you is using a particular research component, like a particular enzyme, Scibot can come in and add an annotation that links to more information about that enzyme and a listing of other published articles that use that same resource. So this is just one example of how, instead of humans annotating, machines can come in and annotate and use the annotation layer as a way to add extra value to a published text. And so there are other use cases as well. There's people are kind of inventing all sorts of new ways to use annotation, because in the end, it's really, it's a very flexible and powerful kind of capability set that can be used in a variety of different ways, as I hope we've seen as we walked through these. It's really just the ability to have a publication online and then offer the ability to decorate that publication with extra information that adds value to the experience of that originally published document of record. And so I'm hoping that maybe some of the folks here in the webinar have started to think about how annotation might actually work in their own context. And so I'll stop talking for a minute and check in with Stephanie to see if we have had any questions along the way about what I've been talking about.
Thank you, Nate. So far, no questions. If anyone has any, feel free to type them in now. I did have a question to kind of kick things off. I'm curious about whether you've seen, in terms of the uptake, both the publishers and the engagement in the annotation layer, any difference between disciplines? Like if certain disciplines tend to engage more, certain publishers tend to welcome annotation more?
You know, that's a really good question, Stephanie. And I would say that I don't think there aren't enough publishers yet who've gone down this road for there to be really clear indications that particular disciplines, stand out. I think that there are definitely in the deeper sciences, the natural sciences and the hard sciences, there's a kind of rigor that is applied. And so in a publication like eLife or bioRxiv, where annotation is enabled, you see a kind of real deep analysis where people are making really thoughtful, deep connections to the material that's published. And so I would say, in those natural sciences, there is there's like a long history in specific disciplines, especially I think in the life sciences and in physics, to have that kind of where the researchers and their audiences already have that kind of the mindset and the history of having that kind of dialogue. And what this hypothesis annotation enables is the ability to have that conversation right in the margin of the text itself, rather than putting it somewhere else on a discussion forum or in an email list or at the bottom of the page in a comment stream. Now, in an example like the qualitative data repository that I was showing, QDR is really attempting to bring that kind of activity to the social sciences, which isn't to say that there isn't a history of conversation in the social sciences, but unlike a lot of the natural sciences that rely so much on quantitative data, in the social sciences that use a lot of qualitative data as well, it's an attempt to kind of bring a new rigor to the qualitative data sets that the social sciences rely on. And so I don't know that it's possible to say yet in these still relatively early days that particular disciplines have different patterns, but it's clear that each discipline seems to be experiencing and finding ways to use annotation that are particularly well suited to the kinds of needs and patterns that they have already set up in their discipline, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about how it contributes to ongoing discussions. We do have one other question, which is, can you speak a bit more about what the mechanism is for publishers' creation and management of various annotation groups? So what does that sort of management portal and what do the tools look like?
Yeah, so they're actually, and I could, let's see, I could probably flip to a live view here and move away from the presentation for a second. And I've navigated to what is the home view of my own personal kind of annotation dashboard, and I'll just start there as a starting place to kind of show you what this interface looks like. When it comes to the group management, there isn't really a whole lot of management to do for the group once it's set up, right? And so there's some decisions to be made around how you want it to be branded, what you want to name it, what kinds of configuration it's going to have in terms of the permissions of who can use it and how it's going to integrate with the user experience of your publication. Once those decisions are made, it's not that they can't be changed later, but there isn't a whole lot of day-to-day management that happens. But there is day-to-day management of the annotation stream, if you will, itself that might happen in that context. And so in this case, I'm looking at my own kind of dashboard that I was talking about before of the annotations that I personally have made. And so you can see I'm coming up on about 1,000 annotations. And here's one of the differences between me and my colleague Heather Staines, who again apologizes for not being able to be here. She has, I think, getting close to 50,000 annotations already. So I have, just a small bit of the kind of annotation she has. But this is the dashboard and the general kind of interface that is available to look at a particular user's annotation. So in this case, because I'm looking at my own annotations, I'm able to see both my public annotations and private annotations that I might have made, because of course I have permission to see my own private annotations. If I were going to look at another user, so for instance, I could decide to look through to Heather's annotations, and I will only be able to see her public annotations. And so the interesting thing here is you still see only about 1,000 matching annotations here. Heather has 50,000, but the vast majority of hers are private, because she uses annotation as a kind of personal note-taking tool every day. So she's making, I guess, hundreds of annotations every day, but most of them are private. So I can use this interface to navigate through and search through annotations that are made by particular users or particular groups. So for example, if I had, as a particular publisher, if I had a publisher group set up that was like kind of the layer of annotations on my publication, on our publication, then I could use the same interface to kind of bring together just the annotations that were produced in that group. And you can see, if I look, actually expand one of these annotations. So Heather had made an annotation on this one document, and there's a variety of things that I can kind of see once I've expanded this. I can see the actual text that she highlighted. I can see the comment that she made, which was, in this case was not that deep. But I can also see information about where that annotation was made, and I could even, God willing, with live demo, I can even go visit that annotation in context on the publication of record. And so this is the kind of interface that one would see. For some reason, her annotation is orphaned here. I'm not sure why that happened in this particular case, but this is a good reason to kind of bring up what happens to annotation when a publication underneath it is either not visible to me as a user, or perhaps has been changed or removed from the internet. And so my guess is that what's happening in this case is I have not logged in or don't have permissions to see this particular document in the way that Heather does. And so for that reason, Research Square is telling me that the annotation is orphaned because I'm not seeing the page behind it. So the annotation still exists, right? It still lives in that server environment, but I'm not able to look at the document, at least right now, in a way that so that the annotation can actually be anchored to that document. And so it appears to me as an orphan. The same thing would happen if a publication were removed from the internet, right? The annotations would persist, but they would be orphaned because the document doesn't exist behind that. And so this gives us another opportunity to see that there's like this moderation flag capability on a particular annotation. And so this is how moderation works in that hypothesis context, where annotations can be flagged and as possibly inappropriate or ready for needing review. And then in the context of a publisher group, where it's your group that you control as a publisher, you have the ability to go in and review flagged annotations and make decisions about whether or not they should be continue to be visible in your layer. So there's a lot of flexibility to this interface, including being able to search by group, user, tag, and so forth, and to jump over to the context of annotations. And so it's the primary interface that you would have as a publisher in order to interact with annotations is going to look like this and act in this way, if that makes sense. Let me pop back to the, see if there's other questions.
Great. I'm not seeing any right now. That was wonderful. It's really nice to see it kind of in action. Apologies putting you on the spot for the live live demo, but that actually ended up being useful to see that the way that comes through when you're not authenticated. Great. Well, unless there's anything else you would like to add, we can kind of wrap up there and let people submit questions after. Is there anything we haven't covered?
Well, I mean, I guess the main point, to make is that Silverchair and Hypothesis have this partnership now where we're working together to enable annotation for, publishers who are using the Silverchair platform. And so, Stephanie, I don't know if you want to add something about the process that you would expect, your publishers to go through in order to kind of work through adding annotation to their publication.
Yeah, definitely. So to do it, it's a fairly simple process. You can reach out either directly to Hypothesis or to your Silverchair representative to kind of get the conversation going about if you want to start an integration and exactly what that integration would look like for you. Being part of the Silverchair universe means that there's no development costs on the Silverchair end to implement standard integrations, and we do prioritize those in-house to kind of help this be a fairly seamless process. So feel free to just get in touch, either directly with Heather or Nate or with your Silverchair rep, and we can kind of get those conversations going. And then otherwise, I will just say again that this is recorded. If you wanted to share this after, you'll be getting a link. You can also send questions in the follow-up survey if you think of anything that we haven't addressed. Nate, anything else from you, or?
I don't think so, Stephanie. I really appreciate you all setting up this webinar and inviting us to participate. And I'll just there's that web address there on the last question and answer slide at web.hypothesis in our odd domain name with the .is/publishing. And that's sort of the publishing gateway. You can go there. There's a contact form there if you want to get in touch. There's more information. There's recorded webinars that we've done in the past. And links to all the blog posts that we've made recently and things like that. So it's kind of one-stop shopping to learn more about Hypothesis in the publishing context.
Great, thank you. And that reminded me too that we do have a guest blog from Hypothesis on our website as well, just kind of going over the value proposition and need for annotation in the industry. That is kind of just a nice bit of context as well, if you want to check that out. Thank you so much, Nate, for joining us. This was wonderful. And we hope that you all have a good rest of your day and to see you on a future webinar.
Happy New Year, everyone. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Bye.